not having a test, a quiz, but you are having a test. And that test, remember, will not have an essay because you are doing the final formal essay due tomorrow, but it will be all multiple choice, a couple of short answer, maybe some true and false, but it's a 100-point test. So it will be all the information that I just talked about, and it's kind of like a very, very, very important and very big quiz. And you must take it at the time. It is a final appointed time. So you need to make sure that you are set up with the internet, everything ready to go so that you can take your final. Okay, let's go ahead and start lecture. We have a lot to lecture today. And we are beginning with the 1850s. What I want you all to understand is that there have been polarizing events between the North and the South pretty much almost since colonial times, where you see the differences between the North and the South emerging. But we had three very big ones during the Jackson Age. You had the nullification crisis, you had Nat Turner's rebellion, and you had the establishment of the American Anti-Slavery Society by William Lloyd Garrison. Those really showed major division. The way the North and the South reacted to them really showed the division between the two regions. But by the time we get to the 1850s, it's almost like the whole decade, something happens to really intensify the division, to really polarize the North and the South. And it really begins in 1850, this decade of conflict, with basically the asking by California to be admitted as a state. Remember, California was part of that Mexican cession, that land given to the United States after the Mexican-American War that was called the Mexican Cession. So I want you all to understand that this decade, beginning with California wanting to come in as a free state, it didn't have slaves, it's just like almost every year, something really polarized the North and the South. And you basically had two countries within one country. And they not only differed over their use of slavery, differed over their ideas of whether slavery should expand to the West. They differed over states' rights. They differed over their power in Washington, how many representatives each of these regions had. And they were very different in culture and social life, the way they emphasized certain things in the North as opposed to what they emphasized in the South, education, the economy. I mean, everything was just very distinct and very different. And everything leads up to that straw that breaks the camel's back, which is the presidential election of 1860, with the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, the first Republican president of the United States. And upon doing this election, you have South Carolina calling for this doctrine of states' rights, saying they have the right to secede from the Union if they voluntarily join the Union. And they secede, and they will be followed eventually by 10 other states and create the Confederate States of America, and you have civil war. So what leads this decade through that path? I mean, this is a very turbulent decade. And it really does begin, as I said earlier, with that California wanting to be admitted as a state. Now remember, California wants to come in as a free state. And they have this very large population thanks to the California Gold Rush, the 49ers that came in the year before. And in 1850, they are like, we have the population, we have the infrastructure, we want to come in as a state. We are ready to go. Now, the New Mexico territory, which included Arizona, slavery these lands. And that there just wasn't the adoption to it. And they are free lands, but people are questioning, wait a minute, can't these lands be opened up to slavery, especially the slaveholding interests? They want to open up these lands of the Mexican cession to slavery. In 1846, before the war against Mexico, there was a proviso that was proposed to this war with Mexico. It's called the Wilmot Proviso. And the idea was to ban slavery in any lands acquired, or if acquired, through this war against Mexico. It did not pass. Now, California wants to come in as a free state. The problem is, if you were to extend that Missouri Compromise line, technically parts of California would be south of that land. And according to that compromise, the Missouri Compromise, maybe these lands were slave lands, but they didn't have slaves. So that brings up the dilemma, not only about California, but about the lands of the Mexican cession. To get California in as a free state, a compromise has to be made. And the compromise is going to include 5 laws or 5 bills, all kind of in one package. And it's all done through a compromise led by the great compromiser himself, Henry Clay, who by now, 1850, is a much older statesman. He is a Whig, but he will partner up with Stephen Douglas, who is a Democrat, a young representative from Illinois, senator from Illinois, who is up and coming and is going to take on this mantle now from Henry Clay as a compromiser. So to save sectional division, they come up with the Compromise of 1850. The 5 bills attached to this compromise are: 1, California will come in as a free state. 2, popular sovereignty will be the guide or the rules, so to speak, in the Mexican cession. What popular sovereignty means is that the people, as they settle these lands, will decide. The people will vote. When it's time for them to come in as a state, they will have to vote whether or not they want to be a slave or free land. Now remember, traditionally these lands not really been suited for slavery or the development of it. The third part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. And we'll talk more about that in detail because this is going to be very controversial. The fourth point of the Compromise of 1850 was the slave trade that was banned in Washington, D.C. Now, this doesn't mean that slavery was banned in Washington, D.C., simply the slave trade. No more selling or buying of slaves in Washington, D.C. It was very symbolic. The fifth point of the Compromise of 1850 has to do with Texas, a slaveholding state. Texas was to give up its claims to parts of New Mexico, really kind of following the Rio Grande into North Mexico, and claims that Texas had that actually extended north of what would have been the Missouri Compromise line. In return, Texas giving up these lands, the United States would give Texas money to help pay its debt. So the federal government would assume Texas's debt. So when you look at these points of the Compromise of 1850, there are some things that benefit the North and some things that benefit the South or the slaveholding states. And here you see the map of what is coming out with what results of the Compromise of 1850. Here's the famous Missouri Compromise line, south of the Missouri border that is extended west. And you can see right here where it kind of cuts off Texas. This is where Texas gave up these land claims. Then you have the New Mexico and Utah territories, and then you have California that's admitted as a free state. Now, if you look, New Mexico and the Utah territories are in purple. popular sovereignty because of the Compromise of 1850 will rule these territories. Which brings us to the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, is the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850. It declared that all runaway slaves were, upon capture, to be returned to their masters, no matter where they were captured. Again, no matter where they were captured. So this meant if they were captured even in free territories, they were to be retaken or relocated back to their masters, sent back. The Fugitive Slave Act, there had been one already in place, but this is kind of the new Fugitive Slave Act 2.0, so to speak, also stated that now federal officials, as well as other law enforcement, including local law enforcement like sheriffs, were to arrest anyone, even in free territories, that they suspected of being a runaway slave. So what you're seeing, in essence, is bringing slavery to the northern states, because for the first time, Northerners are seeing the repercussions of slave laws. They are seeing officials going, arresting, capturing what they are suspecting as runaway slaves. They are seeing the repercussions of this law. They are seeing slavery in many ways in their northern states. And we're going to see radical abolitionists really get people to support them even more because of this, because Northerners are seeing the horrors of slavery firsthand because of these laws. Underground Railroad actually increases its activities. And you even have some local law officials throughout the North passing what are called personal liberty laws, where they refuse to enforce these laws of trying to capture these runaway slaves. This is a polarizing event because the North is reacting in one way to the horrors as they see slavery, and the South is simply saying they are trying to recapture their property. And here you see some actual political cartoons that are talking about the Fugitive Slave Act in the North and the depictions of the horror of trying to capture what is presumed these runaway slaves are in the North. Now remember, presumed runaway slaves, they also were going after free African Americans, and they would have had to prove that they were actually free. And then you have the third polarizing event of the 1850s, the publication of a book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, perhaps the most persuasive piece of literature in all literary history. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the daughter of Lyman Beecher, a minister, part of the radical abolitionist movement, and she herself had been around the radical abolitionist movement pretty much her whole life, the abolitionist movement as well as the radical abolitionist movement her whole life. She had never been in the South. She had never actually been around slavery, but she wrote this very provocative book, a book that changed the way many Northerners saw slavery, because the most important thing Uncle Tom's Cabin did was humanize slavery. The main character is a slave, Uncle Tom, and he is the image of love and purity, the hero who ends up being killed at the end of the book, sacrificing himself for love and for goodness. But this story had some very interesting elements, because in personifying, humanizing, giving a slave in a fictional story feelings, people were identifying with the slave. He was good. And the bad in the story is the master, Simon Legree, who, interestingly enough, in Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, is actually a northerner who owns a plantation in the South. So she was trying, even then, trying not to just pick on the South. She's trying to show how slavery warps everybody. In the end, this little book was a huge bestseller in the North. It sold over 300,000 copies in just the first year that it was published. In Great Britain, it sold over 1 million copies. And obviously, in the North, highly and well accepted book in the South, this book was banned. As more and more people in the North read this book, perhaps more than all the speakers on circuit, this little book had more people join the American Anti-Slavery Society, the radical abolitionist movement, than anything else. In fact, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in the White House in the 1860s, the first thing he said to her was, "So this is the little lady who started this great war." Because he's realizing the importance of that book. He wasn't attacking her. I don't want you all to think it was an attack. It was, in a way, a compliment to her and her book and how she had influenced a whole region. Very polarizing event. The next polarizing event has to do kind of not even with slavery. It had to do with organizing Kansas and Nebraska, organizing them into territories. So you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in 1854. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, what it did was organize the territories for settlement. And it was designed by Stephen Douglas. He was a big promoter of this act. Now, he's trying to organize Kansas and Nebraska because his ultimate goal was to make a transcontinental railroad. A railroad that would connect the East Coast to the West Coast. And he is from Illinois. So he is hoping that that transcontinental railroad is going to go through his state of Illinois. Chicago, he hoped, would be the main hub that would connect the main lines to the West, while connecting to trunk lines or main lines to the East. And so to do this, he realizes that they need to organize Kansas and Nebraska so that they can start the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which, as I said, is going to benefit his state. So as he's designing Kansas and Nebraska as territories and saying we're going to organize them, well, the big question pops up. Are they slave or are they free territories? Well, technically, they're above the Missouri Compromise line, that parallel line. And he decides that it's probably going to gain more support if he simply says popular sovereignty in these. These lands will be ruled over slavery by popular sovereignty. The people will end up voting if they want these lands, slave or free. And all of a sudden, as these acts are passed to organize these territories under popular sovereignty, which technically repeals the Missouri Compromise, there is a mad rush for Kansas. Free soilers, those that want to make sure these lands are going to be free lands, are rushing to Kansas to settle it. But the slaveholding interest, they want to make sure that this territory is going to be a slaveholding territory, and so they're rushing to Kansas as well. And the result is that you're going to have the free soilers and the slaveholding interests all of a sudden butting heads. And butting heads is light. They're going to fight. There is going to be bloodshed. They are going to shoot at each other. There is going to be violence in Kansas. And for the first time, blood is being spilled on U.S. soil directly over the issue of slavery. Directly over this debate. The newspapers out east will call Kansas Bleeding Kansas. And they're going to talk about all the different events, violent events that are happening in Kansas over slavery. There is even stories that Henry Ward Beecher, a minister, radical abolitionist related to Harriet Beecher Stowe, is sending guns to Kansas. These are ministers sending guns, radical abolitionists sending guns. They were called Beecher's Bibles. They were in crates that said Bibles, and they were actually guns. Guns for the Free Soilers, for their protection, and for the protection of the free land, or the land to be free, I should say. This majorly prized the North and the South. The reaction's obviously very different. And the South is feeling very threatened. And they're going to feel more threatened by one of the big events of the 1850s that comes as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that is the establishment of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, ooh, we didn't flip. There we are. Oh, and here are some images of bleeding Kansas, slavery, trying to stuff it down our throats. And then over here, the Free Soilers begging the slaveholders to leave Kansas. But back to the Republican Party, because this really is a big event. It doesn't seem like it's big. It's the start of a political party, but the ramifications will be huge. Founded in 1854 in direct response to this popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, anti-slavery activists, abolitionists, ex-Whigs, ex-Free Soilers, those that have been part of what was this Free Soil movement, modernizers. Modernizers were those that were interested in modernizing the U.S. economy, those that had a vision for the United States and industry, or the railroad, a focus on the railroad, a focus on perhaps not so much the slavery issue, but the modernization of the country. They all unite in this new political party. And the Republican Party holds its first official party convention in July of 1854 in Michigan. Will soon become the dominant party in all the northern free states. By 1858, the Republican Party is a major national party. The Republican Party will have as its platform official policy over slavery. In essence, they are the first major political party to have an actual platform about slavery. And what they said was that they were opposed to the expansion of slavery to the West. No more popular sovereignty, and just no more expansion of slavery to the West. Now, I want you all to think about this. If the slave-holding states cannot expand their slave presence to Western states, then they're only limited to representation in those slave-holding states. And they're never going to get any more representatives because they are contained in one region. And eventually, when you think of all these states to the west being opened up as free states, there will be more representation coming from free lands, free soil. So what this simply means is that the slaveholding interests are going to end up being a very small minority in representation, in power in Washington, D.C., which means that slavery laws could be passed in Washington without them even voting for it. Slavery could end up dying. It does expand to the West. Do you all see now why the southern slaveholding states were very much threatened by the Republican Party and by its dominance in northern free states, And then we have another polarizing event, the Dred Scott case of 1857. That is a portrait of Dred Scott, a slave. Dred Scott is going to sue, and his case, he's suing for his freedom, and his case will make it all the way to the Supreme Court. The case was known as Dred Scott versus Sandford. Now, I'll give you all a little background on this case. Dred Scott, his master, I believe he was a doctor or some kind of medical official, and he had gone with his master, his owner, into a free territory, into a free state, had come from a southern state and gone into a free state. And something happened to him, he died. And Dred Scott is going to say, I'm free. I'm in a free state. My owner has died. I'm free. Well, the descendants of his owner, of his ex-owner, of his dead owner, are saying, no, you're part of the estate. You are also part of our inheritance. You need to come back. And he was supposed to come back and be a slave under them again. And Dred Scott said, no, I am free. I am on free territory and I'm going to sue. And he sues. And it's Dred Scott versus Sandford. He's suing for his freedom. Well, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, the majority of the Supreme Court justices were Southern. So that probably is a big foreshadowing of how they will rule on this case. But this case actually is going to bring in other responses from the Supreme Court. First of all, the Supreme Court is going to say that Dred Scott, or any slave that crosses the Missouri Compromise line, that actually goes into free territory, is not free because they crossed the Missouri Compromise line. In fact, and this is where the Supreme Court even elaborates a lot more, they say the Missouri Compromise was completely unconstitutional. So they are saying it has to be disregarded, the Missouri Compromise line. Why? Because they say Congress cannot restrict the rights to property. And therefore, they cannot restrict the expansion of slavery because slaves are property. And so Congress cannot be passing laws over the expansion of one's property rights. So it immediately makes invalid the Missouri Compromise line. But the Supreme Court goes even further, and they say, in addition, we said all this because this is what we rule. However, this case should have never even made it to the Supreme Court. African Americans, whether slave or not, are not citizens, and therefore they have no rights, no citizenship, no right to use the courts. One of the results of the Dred Scott case, apart from making the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, is that popular sovereignty now became an even bigger issue in the country. And this Dred Scott case comes down as another polarizing event between the North and the South in the 1850s. And then the following year, this issue over popular sovereignty really gets national attention. And it gets it in a Senate race, the Senate race in Illinois. This is called the Lincoln-Douglas debates of the Senate race in Illinois in 1858. So what we're talking here is about Illinois. This is a state race for a Senate position in Washington, D.C. Stephen Douglas, who was a Democrat, is the incumbent. Y'all know what an incumbent means. It means someone that holds the position already. He is facing a challenge against or from the Republican nominee, the lawyer Abraham Lincoln from Springfield, Illinois, who had pretty much not a very, very stellar political career. He had served one congressional term and he hadn't been reelected. But in these debates, we're going to see the emergence of Lincoln, not only as a representative of the Republican Party, but the national face of the Republican Party and the national face of stopping popular sovereignty. So Lincoln, prior to becoming the great Lincoln, realizes that he is fighting an incumbent. This is a difficult thing to do. And so he challenges Stephen Douglas to debates. He's trying to get Stephen Douglas kind of caught in what he says. And he says, I'm going to challenge him to some debates over popular sovereignty. It's a strategy. Stephen Douglas takes an opportunity so he can defend popular sovereignty. And so these debates are going to get national attention from many southern states, northern states, from the frontier. Everybody wants to know what these two candidates are talking about in popular sovereignty. Well, Douglas, in defending popular sovereignty, is going to make a couple of remarks that cost him the support of Southern Democrats, because he talks about how these lands are probably not, people should decide popular sovereignty if it's going to be slave or free, but he makes references to the fact that these lands aren't naturally free slave states, and that slavery perhaps isn't going to expand. I mean, he just makes very disparaging remarks about slavery, even though he's talking about popular sovereignty, and he's going to lose Southern support, Southern Democrats. So remember that in the future. Lincoln becomes the face of the Republicans. He becomes all of a sudden the national face of the Republican Party. Now, in that Senate race, it didn't really matter if the South liked Stephen Douglas or not, or Lincoln, because it's a Senate race in Illinois. Douglas won. Lincoln lost. But Lincoln has emerged as a very powerful figure against the expansion of slavery. And he really has become, for many, the face of the Republican Party. Lincoln was an ex-Whig, born in a log cabin, kind of had a very homespun image. Great speaking ability, great speeches that he himself would write. But he's also a guy from the frontier. At the time, Illinois was still kind of considered a frontier state. And so kind of represented the everyman, but also the guy that had taught himself to be a lawyer. Lincoln was very tall, about 6'4". He was also very, very thin, probably around 160 pounds. Very, very thin. He also had a very angular face, where his cheekbones were very, very pronounced. During these debates, it is sad. This is a story. Okay, I just had a question about what the Whigs are. So let me finish up about Lincoln's story, and I'll tell you all about the Whigs right now. According to the story, a little girl saw Lincoln and while he was campaigning, and said that he probably would look a lot better with whiskers to kind of cover up his face. And well, poor Lincoln, I guess feeling a little conscious, he eventually does grow the whiskers, and then that's the image that we have today of Abraham Lincoln. Ex-Whig, we've mentioned this in past lectures. An ex-Whig, remember, the Whigs were the party that grew out of opposition to Andrew Jackson. And they were the party that talked a little more about industry. They got their support north, the Northwest. And they were the party that was kind of in opposition to Jackson's Democrat Party. But they, by the 1850s, have filtered away. And you have the Republican Party bringing in some of these ex-Whigs. Now, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln made a very important speech about this division, that popular sovereignty was just causing division. And he talked about that a house divided upon itself cannot survive. And what he's trying to say is that this issue of slavery, it's dividing up the country. The country will not stand if this issue is not addressed. In 1859, we have another polarizing event, John Brown's Raid. On October 16th, 1859, at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, an abolitionist, radical abolitionist, as well as ex-free soil fighter in Kansas, John Brown, will raid a federal arsenal. His goal was to get these arms. These are federal guns. I want y'all to understand. So what he's doing is a crime. Okay, this is a federal crime. But he wants to get these guns and lead slave revolts in Virginia and in the South. He has support from Northern abolitionists, but the Southerners, what they see is their fears come true. Their nightmares come true. They had always feared that the radical abolitionists, what they wanted to do, remember that immediate call to end slavery at all costs? This great fear that what they wanted to do was actually come into the South and encourage revolt, do revolts, actually free the slaves violently. And so for them, John Brown's raid is exactly what they always feared. Now, regardless of where people stood on John Brown's raid, it was a federal crime. And the Army does go after Brown and his band of volunteers. The captain that goes after him, interestingly enough, is Robert E. Lee. The officer, I should say, that actually was after John Brown. They will get 10 of them, and they will capture John Brown. John Brown will have a hearing. He will be tried, convicted, and hung for treason. Now remember, what he did was a federal crime. But for the South, it just showed to what extent the radical abolitionists would go. For them, in the South, this was major treason. But for the North, John Brown's raid and how he does die because of this, he's convicted of the federal crime, he becomes a martyr for the anti-slavery movement. By 1859, the South was in a completely defensive mode. What they see is a big threat coming from the North, the Republican Party, John Brown's raid, the fact that popular sovereignty was being questioned. They just, everything they felt was being threatened in their life and existence. To the North, all they could see was the South reacting to this slavery issue. But there were other issues other than slavery. There were economic policies, industrialization in one area, and a reliance on agriculture and cash crop economy on another. High tariffs that affected both. The Transcontinental Railroad, the focus on building this and where it was going to go and who it would profit, what region it would profit. The whole issue of states' rights. By 1859, you really had two different countries under one flag. The South really did see itself as a separate entity and seemed to follow this idea that its honor, its future was at stake, its culture and its power. We talked about early on Virginia, the Virginia monopoly, and all the different Southerners involved in the government and the history. And now the South is feeling very threatened that their way of life will end if they cannot adhere to this slavery. Which leads us to the presidential election of 1860. The Democratic Party will hold its convention in Charleston, South Carolina in 1860, and the convention is just chaos. The Democratic Party cannot unite. It is completely divided between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Democrats in the South were very concerned that the Republican Party was dominating the northern states, and so they're seeing a lot of abolitionist influence in the Republican Party, and that's all they're focused on. And the Northern Democrats are trying to focus on other things, and they're just completely divided. And they cannot get a majority in the whole party on one candidate. So they have to hold the convention all over again in 1860. And this time they hold it in Baltimore. The division and the sectionalism continued. And finally, the Democratic Party is able to endorse one candidate, and that is going to be Stephen Douglas, with this issue kind of as a compromise, popular sovereignty to govern expansion to the West. Southern Democrats didn't like it, and they walked out. They're going to go on and nominate their own candidate, John Breckinridge. Slavery had split the Democrat Party. The Republicans are going to hold their party convention in Chicago, and they realize that there is an opportunity here. And they're going to nominate what they consider as a moderate candidate, Abraham Lincoln. There were other candidates that were much more radical in their views of slavery, and they decide, no, we're gonna have this more moderate candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln, from the very beginning, is going to say, I am against the expansion of slavery. However, Lincoln was willing to tolerate it where it existed. Abraham Lincoln is going to have Northern support, but he's also going to have Western frontier support. He has this homespun image and very good speaker. And the election, the presidential election of 1860, is basically a rematch from the Illinois Senate race of 1858. Abraham Lincoln representing the Republicans and Stephen Douglas representing the Democrats. But Southerners are very, very worried about the Republican victory, which seems almost assured. Remember, the Democrat Party is split. The Republican Party is united. And the South is getting very, very defensive. They become more and more convinced that Lincoln's ultimate goal is to abolish slavery. And Lincoln actually had said, as president, he didn't have that power. But the South is only seeing the threat of its expansion of slavery, which means in the end of slavery. Electing Lincoln to them is the last straw. Now, I do want you all to remember, the South is the wealthiest region in the country. Most of the wealth is in land, slaves, and cotton. The South is producing the most valuable U.S. export, cotton. And in the South, the majority of people did not own slaves. The majority of Southerners were yeoman farmers, small farmers. They didn't own slaves. Yet, this whole region is defensive and are going to defend slavery. Now, I want you all to, I'm going to jump through because this part was a little extra and I'm going to take it out. Abraham Lincoln wins the election of 1860. Yet not one single slaveholding state voted for Lincoln. This is really important because it shows something very significant. Slaveholding states, they've lost their political power as a unit. Not one single Southern state, slaveholding state, has voted for Lincoln, and Lincoln is still president of the United States. The South has lost its power. And the South is going to secede. So, when you review the polarizing events of the 1850s, this is a great slide here in the PowerPoint for you all to really have those notes about the 1850s, and you can see it. 1, the Compromise of 1850. 2, the actual Fugitive Slave Act. 3, Uncle Tom's Cabin. 4, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Republican Party is number 5. Dred Scott case, number 6. Number 7, Lincoln-Douglas debates. Number 8, John Brown's raid. And number 9, Abraham Lincoln being elected in 1860. So very, very key. I'll give you all maybe 1 minute if you all want to take this down, because this is really important, or maybe take a snapshot or I don't know how you do it on your computer, but a screenshot, because this is a great review there. Okay. I'll give you all a few minutes here. In the meantime, I just realized my power is going down, so let me get up with the power. Connected to the power here. Oh, okay. Okay, there. I'm connected to the. And hopefully y'all have had enough time to take it down. So we're going to continue. I can't. Okay, so Southern states' fears are confirmed. They have no more political power. And within 1 week of Lincoln's election, South Carolina has a convention, the secession convention, stating that they voluntarily join the Union, they can voluntarily leave the Union. This whole doctrine of states' rights and nullification and secession that has now all kind of been used to have South Carolina elect to secede from the Union. And they become the first state to secede. 6 states will follow South Carolina in the same way: Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And 3 months after Lincoln's election, these 7 states are going to meet up and organize the Confederate States of America. There are still some border slave states that are in the Union, and as hostilities commence, you will then have 4 more states secede and join the Confederate States of America. In total, 11 states will secede. In March 1861, the Confederate States of America will ratify its Constitution. Its Constitution is going to protect states' rights. And notice, Confederate States, Confederacy. Remember the difference of when we talked about a confederation. This is what this group is now, a confederation. Also, a big difference between the U.S. Constitution and the Confederacy's Constitution is that it protected slavery. Jefferson Davis is elected President of the Confederate States of America. Now, the 8 slave states that still remained in the United States after these first 7 are what we call border states. These were states that bordered the free states, tended to border northern states, and they had a stronger unionist sentiment there. These were the states of North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, Missouri, Arkansas, and Delaware. And on March 4th, 1861, Lincoln has an inauguration. States have already left the Union. But Lincoln says in his inauguration, the minority shall not rule the majority. And please remember what Lincoln says. A minority shall not rule the majority. Lincoln is in a hard situation. He doesn't want to alienate these border states that are still in the Union, but he also doesn't want to threaten these already states that have already left the Union. For Lincoln, the number one goal, beginning on March 4th and throughout his presidency and throughout the Civil War, is to preserve the Union. And that the rule of government, majority rule, will prevail. Lincoln promises that he will not use force against Confederate states unless they are attacked. Unless he is attacked, I mean. And the storm gathers. Okay, guys, I'm going to set up really quick the next PowerPoint, and we'll continue with that. Okay, so let me stop sharing the screen here, and let me set up. Oh, let me go get I left my USB disk, so I'll be right back. So hold on, be right back.
Wait, where'd she go?
She grab her USB.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Why? Because the USB has the PowerPoint on it.
Why are you lying, Nathan?
I'm not lying, I'm paying attention.
Stop lying.
Tommy.
Yes.
I love you.
Same here.
Say it.
Say it.
Ethan. What?
Whisper.
Cutie.
Okay, guys, sorry, I'm back. I had to run all the way to the other part of the office. Okay, let me get this situated and we can start. And okay, my desktop. Uh-oh. We're having issues. No. Why is this doing it? Okay, there we are. Okay. Okay, here we go. Let's go back. And oh, come on. Okay, choose. Here we go. It's uploading. Sorry, guys. It's uploading and we'll get going. Let's see. not up yet on the Blackboard. I didn't know if we'd get to it, and we are, and we'll be able to finish it. So I will be putting the outline to this part of the lecture on today, okay? As soon as I finish, actually. So I'm just waiting for it to convert. And while it's doing that, I'll go ahead and do this. Come on. Come on, come on. Okay. We should be, it's converting. I'm sorry, guys. It's coming up. Yeah. Fix that there. It's coming, it's coming. Okay, yay. Let's go ahead and here we go. Share. Why are you not sharing? Okay. Here we are. Okay. Share. There we are. So, as you hear, Abraham Lincoln is being inaugurated as another Confederate States of America. This other so-called country has started, and we are basically right at the door of the Civil War. The Civil War, which lasts from 1861 to 1865, is the bloodiest war in U.S. history, and more Americans died in the Civil War than in any other war the United States has ever participated. Why? Well, very simply, because it's American versus American. American killing American. So Lincoln becomes the president of a divided nation. And his most urgent problem is this little fort called Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina. The major, the Union major, he's in the Union or U.S. Army, is Robert Anderson, and he is in charge of Fort Sumter. And Lincoln realizes that poor Anderson is very low on supplies because the Confederates have laid siege around the fort. Now, if Lincoln sends supplies, in a way, it's an act of war because he's going into Confederate territory. But if he doesn't send supplies, he's going to lose the fort. So he decides kind of on an ingenious thing. He sends unarmed merchant ships. Therefore, if they're attacked, it's the Confederates that provoke hostilities. April 12, 1861, the Confederates attack Fort Sumter, and you have the first shots of the Civil War. Major Anderson does surrender Fort Sumter to the Confederates, and the Civil War has started. We don't have time to actually talk about all the advantages and disadvantages of the Confederacy. keep Maryland a slave state from seceding, martial law will be declared. And if you think about it, Washington, D.C. is surrounded by Virginia that has seceded, and Maryland that's a slave state. There are slave states that remained in the Union, Maryland being one of them. You also have Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and West Virginia. Lincoln's number one goal is to preserve the Union, keep the Union together, prove that secession is illegal, unconstitutional. So on April 12th to the 14th, 1861, Fort Sumter was intact by the Confederates. By May of 1861, the Upper South had seceded, and you had 11 states now in the Confederate States of America. On April 9th, 1861, Lincoln issues that strategy of blockade, which is the proclamation of blockade around southern ports. And on July 21st, 1861, you have the first actual Civil War formal battle. Just outside of Washington, D.C., it is known as the Battle of Bull Run, or in the Confederacy, the Battle of Manassas. Spectators, people actually went to the battle to see it, took picnics. It happened on a Sunday. They thought Americans surely aren't going to shoot at Americans. And to their surprise, this was an all-out battle. The Confederates will win this first battle, and it's only going to intensify their pride, overestimating their abilities and underestimating the Union's ability and spirit to fight. At the Battle of Bull Run, we're going to see something called the Rebel Yell, which the Confederate Army would do often before big battles. And they make this hurling scream. It sounded like they were slitting a pig's throat, and they would shake the trees right before they actually started the battle. The battles will be fought on two fronts, on the East Coast and on the Western Theater, which was over by Louisiana, Tennessee, the Mississippi River. And on the East Coast, the next major battle, doesn't mean there were other battles, but this is the next major battle, is in August of 1862, which is the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas. Again, the South wins. And the Confederates under Lee are starting to feel that they have a very strong upper hand. And they want to end the war as quickly as possible so that they can get rid of the blockade. So Lee decides to invade the North to end the war. And on September 17th, 1862, he goes into Maryland and encounters Union forces at Antietam, Maryland. And this is the Battle of Antietam. He is going to meet Union General McClellan. And this is the bloodiest day in U.S. history. Many books try to say that the South or the Confederacy lost. In reality, it was a tie. Lee, after kind of realizing he wasn't going to go any further here, regroups his forces and then heads back to the South, back to Virginia. Union casualties were at about 25% of their forces. Confederate soldiers lost about 31%. To this day, the bloodiest day in U.S. history. Well, when Lee returned back to Virginia, though, General McClellan did not follow him, and Lincoln was so angry at McClellan. In fact, Lincoln's having a lot of trouble with the Union generals. Most of the best officers had been Southerners, and they had gone into the Confederate Army. And Lincoln's having a very hard time finding a general over his command as commander of his troops that actually he thinks really follows through. He's very disappointed in McClellan, fires him, and keeps on appointing various other generals. 1863, though, was a major turning point in the war. To begin with, in January of 1863, you have the Emancipation Proclamation. This is an executive order. Lincoln declares all the slaves in rebelling states free. He believes this is going to serve a couple of military purposes. One, he's hoping to encourage these slaves in rebelling states to join with the Union forces and realize that they are free and fight for it. Two, and perhaps an even bigger military purpose, is that this makes slavery the issue of the war. And countries like Great Britain and France that had been hesitant because they wanted to buy Confederate cotton, but they understood it was slave labor and were having their own issues over that, now are just staying out of it. They are not going to get involved in this war. This is a major turning point. And it also shows Lincoln's changing views, because now he's talking about eliminating slavery, period. In Western states like Louisiana and Tennessee, the Union forces had had a little more success, and they're actually were almost in full control of the Mississippi River. It's going to be in 1863 when they basically take control of the Mississippi River. On July 4th, 1863, kind of the last holdout on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg, which was on a bend in the river, falls to Union forces. U.S. Grant, the general of the Union forces, had laid a siege around Vicksburg, beginning on May 18th and ending on July 8th. When Vicksburg falls to U.S. Grant, Union forces have control of the Mississippi River. And another battle that happens in 1863 that is a major turning point, particularly on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Gettysburg. July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, where General Lee is defeated in Pennsylvania. This second attack into Northern Territory fails. Here is the Emancipation Proclamation. And at Gettysburg, which was preceded by Chancellorsville, Virginia, a battle in which Lee had won in May of 1863, but had lost his most trusted right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson. Lee, because of this victory, actually decides, I'm going to just end this war, and goes north. He gets to the most northern point for the rebels, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he encounters a new Union general, Meade. Between July 1st and July 3rd, at the Battle of Gettysburg, there will be a total of casualties that will be 46 to 51,000 from both sides. But the Union forces do win this battle. Lee regroups and runs back to the Confederate Virginia. He will never have the same amount of soldiers and the strength that he had as he approached Gettysburg. But did Meade go after him? No. And Lincoln is angered, fires Meade. At Vicksburg, when Vicksburg fell, not only is Vicksburg a turning point, a battle that is a turning point, but it's a turning point in another way, because Lincoln finds his general, U.S. Grant. I'm going to go over about 3 or 4 more minutes, so hold on, okay? U.S. Grant becomes the commanding general of the Union forces, and he is relocated to the East Coast, to Virginia. U.S. Grant was also a functional alcoholic. His love for the bottle was very well known. And they actually told Lincoln, his aides told him, you can't get him as your main general. He's a drunk. And Lincoln said, give me the name of his whiskey so I can send it to the rest of my generals. Maybe they'll win some battles. General Grant believes in what is known as war of attrition. And this is where you destroy the enemy. You destroy the lands, you destroy the way they make money, you destroy their animals, you destroy their buildings, which is very similar to what his right-hand man, General Sherman, Tecumseh Sherman, also believes in. He believes in total war, and that's when you destroy everything of the enemy. As we go into 1864, General Tecumseh Sherman is going to have total war through the Deep South, beginning with marching into Atlanta, and Atlanta is going to burn up, basically burns down, and then a 16-mile wide lane from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, where he destroys everything, picks up the railroad tracks, ties them, melts them down and ties them around the trees, burns down houses, burns down the cotton fields, completely destroys everything in his path. In November through December 1864, General Sherman marches through Georgia. He gets to Savannah, Georgia on December 21st, 1864, and telegrams to Lincoln, "Merry Christmas, here's your Christmas present, Savannah, Georgia." In his march to the sea, he had done what is called Sherman ties, these railroad tracks that he melted and put around the trees. Lincoln, earlier in November, had been elected to his second term. And then you have, on January 1865, Congress passing the 13th Amendment. Slavery officially prohibited throughout all the United States. On April 9th, 1865, General Lee will surrender to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. General Grant instructed his men to act with respect, to not be screaming and yelling, and to treat Lee with great respect. With the surrender, Lee surrenders the biggest army the Confederacy had, called the Army of Northern Virginia, and it effectively ended the Civil War. The Confederacy had lost. I do want to give you all some quick trivia. There was one final battle of the Civil War. It happened just outside of Brownsville, and ironically, the Confederates won. They had to tell the Union soldiers after they had won the battle that, hello, we just got a telegram, we lost, and they had to surrender now to the Union forces. And the Civil War ended. One quick thing though, I want you all to understand that the Civil War was the first truly modern war. It had modern weapons like grenades, gun rifles, arms that repeated themselves, almost, you might say, automatic weapons, not quite, metallic cartridges, and the Gatling gun that would go rapidly through bullets. They had telegraph and they had railroads, and they even had air power, not quite planes, but they used balloons to fly up over the fields and to see. It was a little technically hard because you could easily shoot a balloon. You even had submarines. You had ironclad warships, and you had mass production of war materials. Within 2 weeks of Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by a Confederate supporter, John Wilkes Booth. I wanted to tell you all, and we'll end this lecture with some very interesting tidbits. Abraham Lincoln, killed in 1865, had a secretary. His private secretary's name was Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, who will be assassinated in the 1960s, had a private secretary named Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln lost a son during his presidency. John F. Kennedy lost a baby, a young son, during his presidency. Abraham Lincoln was technically assassinated in the South. John F. Kennedy was technically assassinated in the South, Texas. Both these presidents fought for civil rights. Both were assassinated by assassins of 3 names. I don't know if that's eerie or we look too much for interesting coincidences, but it is all very interesting. On that note, I apologize for going over 7 minutes, but you have all the lecture. I'll be putting this outline on Blackboard right now. And no, I have not graded the study guides. I will as soon as I have some time. Actually, I did. I just haven't posted them. Anyhow, that's it, guys. You all are good to go. And I'll be putting announcements and reminders about the essay and about your final exam, what time and everything. And we're good to go. You all are good to go. Bye. Thank you for your patience.
The study guides you had created, was it from the last chapter?